and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a podcast that we put on the internet so that you can listen to it. In this podcast, we talk, as we ever do, on the topic of designing better miniature games. My name's Mike. I've designed some. His name's Glenn. He's designed some. We are in the midst of a short series here on the topic of when should something be a miniatures game. We bump into this question quite a lot, and our lovely Discord community, click the link in the show notes below to join our Discord community. People are often wrestling with this question because when you get infused with an idea for a cool game, sometimes it's not always immediately obvious that the miniatures that you're imagining being in it are actually the best expression of that game. And so we've considered a couple of different ways of tackling this question in terms of if your game is about something or something else, what would the clues be that it's a good candidate for a miniatures game? We have talked a couple of times now about the fact that we think that these miniatures games are about the relationships of markers in models and terrain in physical space, and that they are unique in that they can accept any kind of physical object can be thrown down into the play area, and somehow the magic circle will transmute it into a piece of game material, and we can put a shoe and say, oh, this is blocking terrain. We know what this does. I think one of the things that is perhaps more cryptic to me, although I've played a lot of board games and indeed have played a lot of Euro games, one thing that's less obvious to me when I think about miniature games, because I tend to come at them from a sort of models and the loveliness of what it will look like on the table first, is an idea that Glenn has thrown around a couple of times on this podcast about how you kind of tackle the pacing and the arc of your game, and specifically how you deal with the fact that you want the beginning of the game to be a sort of lovely potential filled spectrum of opportunities, and you want the end of the game to be extremely tense and exciting, and there are a number of ways of achieving that kind of acceleration towards an exciting conclusion. And Glenn, you have got names for two, one of which I think you've made up, but tell us a little bit about laddering and zeroing.
Yeah, so one of the classic pieces of advice that get given to neophyte game designers in the board game area is that you cannot be doing the same thing on your last turn as you did on your first turn. And like
that would be a bad game.
That will be that will be the sort of thing that a publisher will give you in like a note when he refuses your game. What is different about what you're doing on the last turn as what you're doing on the first turn. And
even though things like whist and stuff are kind of that.
Well, I mean, the thing is, even whist, you start off with a certain number of cards. You're meant to chuck a card out like each round. So by the last round, so it's at least different.
Oh no, that's true. Yeah. If you're playing that kind of that descending, and
yeah. So
we always play the V shape where you end up with more cards, but whatever.
And I think that many people would say, yeah, who plays whist a lot? Would you try and sell somebody whist in the modern day?
All right, fine.
And a term I have heard knocked around in a handful of game design blogs and things for the way that most board games do this is a laddering process. And I think, sort of having tried to look this up due to talking about this conversation before having this conversation, I think that might have been taken from game design psychology and user interface. But anyway, the idea being, like, if you imagine an engine building game, you start off able to do like really weedy, crappy little things, and then you build a bit of an engine, and that poops out more stuff with which you can build more engine, and blah, blah, blah. And then by the end of the game, on the last turn, you're cranking this mightiest machine that chucks out millions of dollars and etc etc etc, so that, like, on the last turn you feel like you've really done something, you've really progressed. It feels very, very different from your first turn. And this is the idea of laddering, that the reason your last turn is different from your first turn is you are much more powerful and influential, and you're doing much more cool stuff on your last turn. Now, war games, miniatures war games, and sort of boxed tabletop war games as well, that's almost certainly clearly not the case. At some point in between the first turn and the last turn, a lot of your dudes have had their heads blown off, and so you are not more powerful on the last turn than your first turn. You are almost certainly much weaker. Um, and that
and,
should
and and maybe not even, and power almost feels like a kind of loaded term there, because you could interpret power as ability to influence the outcome of the game, but like just in terms of raw like capabilities, like the number of spellcasters and artillery pieces and psychers, and like you've just got less stuff to deal with available to you, as like the sort of the opposite of an engine builder.
yeah, like yeah, I mean the classic board game example of this is obviously chess. You know, at the start of a chess game, you've got tons of pieces and tons of choices, and the end of a chess game, you've got barely any choices at all. But
Mhm.
definitely the end of a chess game is way more interesting than the start of a chess game, despite the fact you've got, in theory, way more choices at the start of a chess game.
Right, so we know that laddering is not like the only way to create an interesting end game.
Yeah, and why is it that chess is more interesting at the end, and why does it seem to be that war games are more interesting at the end, despite you having fewer choices and less of your toys and etc. etc. And I've dumped the name of zeroing onto this because it feels like, well, it's like you're zeroing in on a target. You know, it's like you're a, I don't know, a bomber plane going in for a run, and the takeoff is completely dull. And the closer you zero in on your target, the more interesting, exciting, and important your choice is.
But also the pun being that you go from 100% of your force to potentially 0% of it.
Yes, you also literally zero your force as you go along. And part of what I think is it sort of intrinsic to the zeroing process is that at the start of a game that relies on zeroing, you've got a lot of largely meaningless or very obscure, very bushy choices that might turn out to be the choices that are going to influence the end of the game, but it's really hard to tell whether they are or not. It's really hard to tell whether, like, the opening movement of a unit in Warhammer was particularly significant. And then as your guys get knocked off, it becomes more and more obvious which choices are incredibly important and are really pivotal. And so while you are making fewer choices, it feels like each of the choices you make is more powerful. You know, you are making choices that more heavily influence the end of the game. Almost certainly you're not, but they definitely look that way. It definitely looks like the things you do on the last or next to last turn of a game of Warhammer, you know, sort of pivot and turn the game in a way that the things you did in the first two turns on, like to the degree where in Hobgoblin you've tried to hack out the first turn because it feels like you're never making any interesting decisions during it, you know. And as what is going to decide the game comes into clearer and clearer focus, the choices we make become more and more significant seeming, and the game feels like it is picking up momentum and picking up speed and moving towards a cinematic climax. And it's interesting, actually, like a lot of video games go down this route. Like, you know, various first person shooters, a lot of the time you get loaded up on like weaponry and armor and health before you go into the boss fight, so that ideally you kill the boss with like your last bullet when you're on 1% health, and there's your climactic moment. And it's one of the problems with laddering, where just as you get to the point where you're having the most fun and you're cranking this, look at my awesome Splendor engine and look at the greatness it's doing and the things it's pooping out, and oh, and now it's over. Um,
Mhm.
and some people do say it's like, and sometimes you get a point where people are like, oh, if I had one more turn, if only I had one more turn. You
Yeah, no, like we've routinely played Race for the Galaxy to like 15 planets rather than 12, or 14 rather than 12. I can't remember exactly the numbers, because me and my dad were always like, but we just got it humming.
Yeah, and in a really good game, you feel that way when it ends, and you go, "Let's just do one more turn just to see," and then you play like one or two more turns. You go, "All right, that's why they cut it off at that point. They really, really knew their onions because it's great just getting there, but once I've got a
Yeah.
hold of it, it's sort of like, fine, I'll turn the knobs and poop will spit out the far end, and that'll be lovely." But with zeroing, you don't have to worry about that so much because it's like, well, everyone's got all of the toys they're going to have at the start of the game. Maybe you have to worry about, are they going to get their favorite toy taken off like really early and never
Mm.
get to see it be the awesomeness that it is. Um, but certainly, you know, it's a different way of sort of making it so that what you do on the last turn isn't the same as what you do on the first turn, and a different way of making that interesting. Now,
Okay, yeah, okay. So we have the definitions. Like, so what do we do with these definitions? So I've got a game idea. Should this be a miniatures game? How do I intersect this pair of definitions with my new idea for a miniatures game? What am I looking for? What clues am I looking for?
well, I mean, the sort of not the obvious, but one of the things from that description is, what level of bringing new troops on, assuming that you're doing some sort of war game, like what level of adding things onto the tabletop
Hmm.
as the game progresses, is there going to be, and what probability is there that the things you are going to add onto the tabletop are meant to be mysterious and interesting and decided during the game?
Hmm.
Because it's like, I've having this conversation actually in the Discord at the moment, somebody who wants to have a game with where you can summon in like a big mighty like centerpiece model, and it's like, well, if there's a possibility that you're not going to get to summon in your big lovely centerpiece model, then I've made you paint a lovely big centerpiece model that's loads of fun to play with, and I've gone, not for you today, you know.
Hmm.
But equally, if you're definitely
And
going to,
so that's not necessarily saying, well, it's not saying that's intrinsically good or bad. It's just saying that that's sort of fighting against the conventions of this form. Because like the game itself doesn't care, but like as a cultural experience, you care as a player.
yeah, I mean, yeah. And as an example for this, I think it would be fair to say that one of the larger barriers to entry to playing A Billion Suns is the fact that people don't know exactly what ships they're going to need when they're playing, and people are sometimes expected to like maybe jump a bunch more ships in on like turn two and
Right, and I was thinking about this because this was part of Glenn and I were chatting about whether A Billion Suns has laddering in it or not, and it got me thinking about like for me, and this is just because this is where I started with these sorts of board games, like Settlers of Catan has a very obvious, although somewhat simple, laddering system where I collect resources so that I can build settlements or cities, and then I collect more resources so I can build more settlements and cities. And the comparison here between A Billion Suns and Catan was, I was thinking, well, the reason Catan can do this is because you only get 5 settlements and 4 cities. So I've got like a limited pool of it's like, well, wait a minute. If you just had like 2 battleships and 5 gunships and that's all you were allowed to build, wouldn't that sort of be an effective way of dealing with laddering, which is spoilers how Rotwalden is dealing with this as well. Like, so I guess one of the questions I've got about laddering and zeroing is this a convention or a tendency, or like this is just where the water runs downhill? It's not formally required that you choose one or other of these routes, and you could potentially make a real-time strategy game as a miniatures game. It's just you're going to have to fight through the demons of hell to make it work.
well, I think also again, and I think this whole process of deciding what sort of game you're making ends up being like a series of like feedback loops, where like you, as you were saying, well, if I say you're allowed X many battleships and X many corvettes and X many fighters in A Billion Suns, then maybe it is an actual laddering thing because, and it's like, well, if you've given me a specific list of exactly what I am going to be allowed, not a suggestion, why not stick all those into a box for me? You've told me exactly what I'm going
Right.
to be allowed. You've given me a very specific thing. This is exactly what you'll get. You don't get like up. They're going to be this sort of preset thing. Put them in a nice box for me and save me a whole bunch of hassle. And tell you what, while you're putting things in a box, are there some other solutions to some other problems in your game design that might be handy if you can put bespoke things in, and then it feeds back into itself where it's like,
No, sure, and that's when I would, but it won't be the episode where I do go off on my rant about miniature cinematography and stuff. But yeah, like I see what you mean, which is that you're like, well, you're sort of shifting this counter lever backwards and forwards between possible kind of product poles that you could end up on, and if you're saying, well, what I need is this, what I see is this laddering where I can bring in a certain range of objects, and that range is discrete. Well, okay, now we have a discrete element to the game, and so we could maybe think about, are there other things that could be discrete as well?
yeah. And I think also like the whole of your game is a holistic thing, and it's a product as well as being sort of a game. And I think that the best expression of a game is the one that is easiest for players to access, quick for them to get a hold of, easy to understand, and easy for them to get to the meat of what the fun thing is. And there are a set of barriers involved with a miniatures game inherently, and they're barriers we accept because the benefits of them, the benefit of me just getting a book for a miniatures game is, well, that's cheap for something that I can then have be the biggest game that I own with the most stuff involved in it. It looks absolutely stunning. It covers a 6 foot by 4 foot table, and it costs a fraction of what a game that takes up a fraction of the space and looks a fraction as good does when it's in a boxed game. But if I'm going to do it in such a way where giving you a box makes your life easier, cheaper, more fun, then okay, well, how else can I design this? What else can I put into it? What other choices can I make? How else will that inform my design decision? And sometimes it's just one or two of these things that make you sort of start going, oh, well, just a minute. If I'm putting it in a box, I can put in like some bespoke cards. Oh, and
Mm.
I can then put in some counters. Oh, and that thing that I was doing with like buildings and like doing this really arcane thing of defining a building. I'll give people the buildings as like cardboard things, and I can cut the terrain section from 50 pages to one. And and that's when I think your game sort of starts going more, okay, well, now we've got a boxed game, we've got
Yeah.
different choices, different concerns, different affordances, different abilities, and I think it ends up sort of snowballing into itself at that point. And
Yeah,
I
that makes a lot of sense. I will pick on one thing that you said there because I'm not sure I completely agree with it, which is I think one of the things that I am um often considering is that the best expression of a game is not necessarily the easiest expression of the game to get into, because like on the journey from accessibility to inaccessibility is this wonderful like happy place of investment where I take a little bit of like escape velocity to get over the hump of being involved in in my game, and now I'm really involved in your game and I'm excited because I bothered to get the miniatures or paint the terrain or whatever. And I think that for a game like for a kind of game like ours, which has the potential for a hobby loop, I think we end up in a place where some of the like some of the very like core sort of tenets of like, well, designing things should be obvious what they do, and they should be easy to get into, and products should be accessible. I think with a product like ours, like there is an element which like, well, there's somewhere in between there where it's like has to be difficult enough. I'm not saying gatekeep it, but it's like has to be difficult enough that when you've got into it, you're like, yes, I'm here, I'm one of the tribe.
I mean, it is tricky. I mean, as an independent game designer, you may as well get benefit out of that because the people who are playing your game are going to be the in crowd anyway, because
Yeah,
there's
that's true.
five of them and their mate. So you may as well make it like into a bit of
Luxuriate in your ivory tower.
but I also think it's like the places where you make it hard for somebody to play the game are specific choices you have to make. If it's like, you know, oh, you've got to acquire these obscure models and kit bash them and do all these kinds of things, well, that's lovely. That's an evolved process, and you can then show off your kit bashed model. If it's like, okay, you have to print off 50 cards with like matching card backs and produce them out and cut them out very finely. It's a bit more like, no, that is not a nice thing to make life hard for people. That's the thing where you should have given them that deck of cards, damn it.
All right, so potentially the last question, but we shall find out on laddering and zeroing. In your opinion, or in your experience of sort of knocking about designs in this direction, do you feel that laddering requires more cardboard components than zeroing tends to require, because zeroing can start with the things that we had anyway, which is miniatures, and by a process of attrition just naturally provide that game, whereas laddering has to have some cards or boards or ding dongs.
I think that if you are interested in a game that is built on laddering, I think that cardboard bits and bobs will make the game more enjoyable and more accessible.
Right, rather than having to have more and more fingers in your rule book to go, okay, well, now I've got this, and now I've actually got this as well, and now I've got this, and I have to remember all the rules.
Well, yeah, and also like one of the things of laddering is that you don't necessarily want to know which options you're gonna be presented with halfway through the game at the start of the game. And so sometimes you
Right,
want.
because otherwise there would be no mystery. It would just be like, well, I'm pre-programmed my route through this tech tree.
Exactly. And so you sometimes want to pull out the cards, and it's like, oh well, this one's a hydropod and this one's a hollow ship. I don't know what either of them do. Oh, luckily this card has got written on what both of them do. I'm literally learning and processing, the way they're going to fit into my engine as I'm pulling them, which necessitates, bits of cardboard. And then, once you're giving somebody one bit of cardboard, you may as well give them another bit to make their life easier. And probably if you're laying out these cards that are in a tech tree that relate to other cards, it might be nice to give them something to lay them onto that will have some iconography that will explain what the hieroglyphics on the cards are, and you're onto a whole thing. Whereas, yeah, if you're doing a zeroing process, I come to the table with my army list, which I have written and studied, and I know exactly what everything in it does, and I've got the miniatures representing it. I don't need any cards and doodads on the table because I know the stat line for my ogres, and I know exactly what my hero. I need like a one.
Right, and throughout the game, what happens is I just need to remember fewer and fewer of those facts that I know.
Exactly, and at no point am I going to suddenly pick up a new magical item and then have to draw it out of the deck. And obviously I could. We could do that. We could give you objectives that suddenly give you an extra power that you didn't have, but it's a very limited and tricky potato to boil that particular.
And so drawing the comparison back to TCGs, which we did in the last conversation, when I compare this to Magic, we actually end up with like two deep, complicated games that afford a lot of pre-planning, one of which uses laddering and one of which uses zeroing, because at the beginning of a game of Magic, I got nothing, and I haven't built my tableau, and by the end, I'm slamming down all kinds of spells and monsters, and all kinds of groovy stuff is happening. Whereas in Warhammer, I slam down a massive load of stuff, and we charge forward, and yeah. I
Yeah.
think what's interesting as well is thinking about like um we were looking, I was looking at the characteristics of games and slingshotting some pictures of graphs to Glenn from the section on I forget what it's called. It's like the decision density part of it. And I think what's interesting is that in those two games you can sort of describe the how interested and complicated my decision making is in a fairly similar arc, in that like whether it's a game of Magic or whether it's a game of Warhammer, like I've kind of know what I'm doing right at the beginning. There's not that many interesting decisions to make. I'm just going through the motions of getting set up. I'm kind of coming to this knowing like, well, the cards in my hand that matter because I've practiced with this deck. I know which cards are important, or like I know which units need to be moving. And I don't have I got a lot of decisions I could make, but very few of them matter, or very few of the options I'm presented with I'm actually going to consider and take. Whereas in the middle, when it gets very messy and it could go either way, there's an enormous spike in interest about how I've got a technically limited now set of decisions from where we began, or rather in Warhammer it's come down, in Magic it's come up, but we're in this sort of sweet spot where like there's a lot of interesting decisions. Many of them are quite juicy. A lot of the options seem equally important. I'm not sure exactly where to put pressure or resources. And then towards the end, the snowball started rolling and we kind of know where we are, and the decisions again become a bit less interesting. And that's fine because we're kind of trying to hurry towards the end because we kind of see what's happening. And so that narrative arc is the same in terms of my emotional involvement and decision making process for the game. Laddering and zeroing just, I guess, gave me different initial board states, and they just provided different kind of pathways to achieve that same kind of musical arc.
Yeah, I think it's a bit about like what you want, maybe what you want the emotional experience to be at the end of the game, because a lot of the time with laddering, it's not much of a choice on the last turn. You pull the lever and then you watch the cogs dance and see your genius, taking place, on the tabletop. In the final, moments of a war game, the two generals.
Remaining bloodied combatants, finally
Yeah,
two axes embed in each other's skulls simultaneously.
exactly. And
A
it's like,
single crow crowds across the battle. Yeah, no, it's
yeah,
definitely different.
how do you want your player to feel powerful and important? Do you want
Hmm.
them to like pull a crank and see their majesty take place that they have built up as a self-made man, or do you want them to be like, he's the last guy that rah, boff, there we go. That was significant because it was the closed fist of judgment mailing down upon my opponent, and it was definitive because that was the last guy in the unit, so I know that it was significant. And it's, yeah, and I think that I do see people sometimes talking about doing real-time strategy games as minis games,
Oh
and I
God, I mean, yeah, don't even talk to me about it. Like, I,
and I,
number one, I'm obsessed with it, and number two, I've kind of tried. Did I succeed or fail with a billion suns? I don't. I'm not ready to admit either way.
And the thing is, it's one of the things. I don't think it's an immutable problem. I think that doing it in a way where it wouldn't be better to give people cards and counters is what is the hard problem. And I'm not, you totally can do it with minis, but it feels like ice skating uphill, and it feels like sometimes giving people a bitter little sweetie to suck on, where it's like, I
So,
paid for this thing and it's just not getting used.
so this is what's bugging me out at the moment. Is obviously Go is an extremely discrete game. It's got a grid, you place things on intersections, but it's got a very obvious laddering thing where like you begin with a pristine board and then complexity builds across the hundreds of moves. And the thing that's in like the relationships between pieces are very important. Obviously they're discretely important. It matters whether it's literally next to it, and what the lines of things that are connected are. But it does make me think like, is there a game that takes two cues from Go, which is pieces don't move but remain interesting in their relationships, and you begin with nothing, and you like and things grow. And I don't know what that is, and maybe it's not even like it doesn't even resemble a war game, but something to do with like I don't know, like I'm just thinking about this idea of like, well, how do I put down immutable things, whether they're towers or flowers or something, and like it matters that the light can hit a particular flower at a certain time of day or something, and the flowers can't move, but where I placed them was important, and blah 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 blah.
Yeah, but then, and I say, doing that in a way where it would not be better if it were a boxed game is for me the important and difficult question. Because there's definitely games where that's interesting. Those games definitely exist. Are they better if they are a minis game? Not sort of, I can do it as a minis game. You probably can do it as a minis game if you put the player through enough torture. You probably can, but maybe don't put them through
Well,
the
yeah, and this I think is hugely connected to the conventions of the form, and I think that's one of the struggles I've got with this overarching conversation is I'm constantly tripping myself up on what is a intrinsic strength of the form versus what is a current social sort of reality of the form, which is there is a certain kind of audience, there is a certain kind of social convention around these things, there's a certain kind of product availability. Like if I wanted to make, because I'm obsessed with the idea of making a miniatures game that uses farm animals. I know I'm not the first person to think of this, but like, my mum grew up with farm animals. My kids have these little farm animals. Like it's a very common physical toy that very much resembles Gasland's cars or toy soldiers that the original war games emerged from. Like they ought to be something to do with farm animals, but no one has bothered to come up with it yet.
Well,
And
it's
I think that is not to do with the convention. I don't think that's to do with the formal constraints of miniature games. I think that's to do with more to do with the the current cultural conventions around it.
I don't know. Possibly, it's like I say, it's a thing of okay. Well, what is that game about? Well, it's going to be to some degree about like maybe the AI of the creatures. Well, AI is easier if I put it on a grid and give you a card to operate it with,
Mm.
right? So box game then, box game, or you're making life pointlessly hard for people. It's like
Or it's an animal farm thing where it's like, well, actually, they're just soldiers, and it's like, well, you just made another war game. It's
yeah,
not.
yeah, and it's like okay, well, why is non-discrete space through which the animals move interesting, important, and better than discrete space? It's like the thing you're talking about placing counters onto the table. It's like why would do I care that I can put a shoe on the table and the relationship between the two counters either side of it is interesting, and why is that more interesting than having a grid and at the start of setup sticking just a flat, mindless barrier into the grid, and that therefore will make life easier for me and easier for my players. It's why is it better as a minis game,
Mm.
than a box game, rather than, can it's not, ask whether you should do it rather than whether you can do it. Take a
Well,
leap.
and I think this will probably transition us into a final conversation in this series of why should something be a miniatures game. So I'm going to contain my final uh subtopic on this for next week and next conversation.
Well, in that case, we'd best wrap up this conversation so we can get onto the thrilling excitement of what Mike has to say next. If you want to know what Mike has to say next, go down to the comment section and ask us. I won't tell you, but I'll
He
know by.
doesn't know yet. Well, perhaps he does because he's already edited the next episode. But what you should do is click subscribe because we are rapidly approaching 2,000 subscribers, which I'm led to believe great wealth, riches. We get new shoes. It's incredible. It's going to be wonderful for all of us.
Yes, pop down there, hit the like and subscribes, and check out the comment sections. Mike mentioned at the top, there's a Discord where you can go and have these conversations. Also, in that link section, there is Mike's Patreon where you can go by and. In case YouTube don't throw shoes at us when we hit 2,000 subscribers,
Will they
you
not?
can give him enough money to buy his children's shoes, which will encourage him to continue making these videos and for Rule of Carnage to go on as a channel. But for now, and from this episode of Rule of Carnage, and from us, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and
Thanks for listening. Bye bye.